And tonight's tale, Whispers of the Past, the song, Part 2. Berenice. Berenice. Wake up, Berenice. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. The rectress was on her knees, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders, shaking me. It was curious, for I'd never seen her so dishevelled before. She was always prim and proper, put together with the utmost of care. Yet here she was, wide-eyed and in such a state of disarray and undress that I thought for a moment that surely I must be dreaming. I moved my arms, testingly. They seemed to respond all right. My legs, likewise, moved at the slightest of commands. Nothing appeared to be broken or otherwise damaged, though the world seemed now to possess some strange quality that, whilst I could not notice, somehow, that something had shifted within my perception, I was at a loss to name the change. I sat up, slowly. "Rectress?" I asked quietly. "Are you quite all right?" The rectress had stopped shaking me as soon as my eyes had opened, her own closing softly from the wide expression of concern that they had borne just a moment ago as she straightened herself up, the practiced mask of calm falling over her face and wiping it clean of any previously revealed emotion. "Yes, of course, and what of you? You appear to have collapsed and made a dreadful mess in the process." I noticed then, for the first time, that she was absolutely right. Looking about from my seat on the floor, which was illuminated by the small lamp that the rectress must have brought with her, I saw that my own lamp had apparently collapsed to the floor with me and shattered into several large pieces and countless smaller ones besides. It was a wonder that a fire did not catch upon the room. Strewn about me, all over the floor, there were a number of dolls in varying shapes and sizes, scattered haphazardly, as though they had been flung unceremoniously from the shelves in a fit of passionate rage, many of their faces having been marred by such violence done to them. A small handful of them looked as though they had been thrown in the direction of the fireplace, missing their mark of the blackened stone pit that would contain logs for burning, had it been alight, and landing on the mantel. At that moment, Wandsworth appeared, looking harried, his face awash with horror and concern, and he crossed the room at once to attend me, brushing a few pieces of broken glass from my dress and helping me to my feet with a constant stream of worried words to mind my step but for the glass and to inquire about injuries and the like. "I'm quite all right, Wandsworth," I said, with a slight laugh, the joy of which I did not feel, to allay his concern. The rectress accompanied the butler and myself from the parlour, past the grandfather clock with its familiar sweeping pendulum, and up the stairs towards my room, before excusing herself back to her own chambers, apparently loath to remain, even before the staff and myself, in her present state. Wandsworth left with my apologies, and his assurances that he should have the parlour back in good order before the morning. With the door closed at his leaving, I was swept by the feeling of utmost sorrow and pity for him, having to spend untold hours rectifying the mess that I had made. For no doubt he would be replacing each doll with the utmost care back to its place on the shelf, and scrubbing the lamp oil from the floor and small rug in the centre of the room. Certainly, it was his occupation to keep the manor in presentable order, as it had been for nearly 50 years. But I needn't add to that burden with my foolish behaviour. After nearly 20 years tending to the house in relative solitude, for much of the staff were dismissed after Father had passed, Wandsworth, despite conservatorship over the estate, had not required nor desired to maintain the expense of multiple salaries in my absence, content to maintain the manor and grounds alone, save for the stable hand. I tended the horses until they were either sold or aged. I recalled the letter nearly 5 years ago now that Wandsworth had sent, informing me that he had finally bid farewell to the young man that attended, exercised and cared for the magnificent creatures in their time. My heart wrenched and ached for him. The realisation of all the time spent surrounded by empty halls and silent rooms. I fought to stifle the sob at the loneliness that must have crept over his soul, accumulating over time like so much dust to weigh upon him as he made his rounds, sweeping and dusting and polishing. His frequent letters to me, likely being his own real contact with another human being, and likely his only respite from the solace. I bit my lip as I tried to fight off the tears that threatened to fall as I stripped out of my day clothes. Now here, at last, I had returned home, and Wandsworth was no longer alone. Only for me to come with news that I intended not to stay, but rather to sell the estate that had been his life's work. Trusted and valued enough by my father to not only be caretaker in his absence, but guardian of his only child. Wandsworth had borne the news in silence, to which he was no doubt accustomed, taking it in stride, and still he decided to continue his affiliation with the family by remaining underemployed at the Institute. And there I go, destroying the parlour that he had so painstakingly kept in order for all of these years. I made my way to the sink in the bathroom in order to wash up, shaking my head several times to clear it, and try to recall exactly what had happened. I could not remember having removed even a single doll from its wanted position on the shelving, and yet nearly every one had been strewn about the room, seemingly at random. Only a few, small few, no more than perhaps 5, had remained upon the shelving, their heads still resting gently on one shoulder, faces pointed dutifully towards the portrait of my father that hung up above the mantel. If we were to have fainted and reached out for something to prevent my fall, I might have managed to pull a few from the shelf, or were my arms to be flailing wildly as I descended to the ground, a few of the neighbouring shelves might have been disturbed as well. And yet, each shelf, from the entire length of the room, had seen its tranquil placements torn asunder, on the east wall as well as the west. Despite the room being spacious enough that I might stand with my arms out at full extension 2 times over, perhaps 3, and the length of the room from doorway to fireplace being several paces in length at the very least. It seemed unlikely, therefore, that the devastation wrought about the room was the result merely of my fainting at the sight of my father's visage for the first time in years, as it hung illuminated upon the wall. No, something else must have happened. I dipped a small cloth in water from the sink and dabbed gently at my face and in the back of my neck, the cool water feeling positively frigid against my superheated skin, but serving its purpose to remove the flush that had developed over my flesh and to wipe away that gentle, small sheen of sweat that had begun to appear. After I cleansed my arms and legs, removed my underclothes, and slipped into some proper night clothes, I pulled back the blanketing of my bed and climbed in on top of the soft bedding, snuggling down into it and the pillows for a moment of bliss, with a quiet sigh of pleasure. For the bedding, most certainly, was luxurious. That is not to suggest that the accommodations of the Institute had been either shabby or unfitting, simply that they were adequate, if not bordering on excessively firm in comparison to the plush softness of my own bed. I had not slept in such a bed in many years, indeed not since my childhood, and I revelled in it, though perhaps too much. For I began tossing and turning after a time, unable to find a comfortable position in which to sleep, my mind distressed. Ultimately, I realised that I had behaved quite foolishly, making a spectacle of myself before Wandsworth and the rectors in such fashion that not only frightened these 2 dear companions of mine, but of which the rectress would no doubt disapprove. Shame flooded through me then, and I wished that I could sink into the pillowy softness of the bed, deeper and deeper, with the weight of the blankets on top and beside me, closing in hand upon me, until I disappeared altogether. My cheeks burned with the embarrassment, blazing warm pinkness as I pressed my eyes closed from the light, as though the weight of the judgment from Providence itself had laid me bare with omnipotent eyes. I drew the blankets up around me tighter, that I might shy away from the blunder, the failure, the disgrace of the scene that I had caused. I had been a fool, a childish, ill-tempered, impulsive and uncontrollable fool to behave in such a fashion, though I could not recall having done so. But this made it all the worse, for such evidence enough of the actions was far too momentous to lie in denial, and yet so beyond thought and reason and composure of a lady, that I had not even the powers of mind to recollect the complete and utter failure in behaviour. For shame that I should disrespect my father's wishes and the careful attentions of the rectress, who had devoted years of her life to my finishing, to behave so egregiously. My eyes burned as I reflected on my misbehaviour, or rather, the absence of recollection of those misbehaviours, and I hastily brushed bitter tears out of my eyes. I threw aside the blankets and leapt out of bed at once, crossing swiftly from the bed towards the large trunk, which sat to one side of the room, having been brought up by Wandsworth when the rectress and I had arrived, and I knelt before it swiftly, tugging bodily at the clasping and heaving the lid open. Enough was enough. Clearly, I had fallen to pieces upon seeing my father's face, torn apart by grief or longing or some other silly emotion unbefitting of a lady of means, and had lost myself to hysteria on accounts of unresolved issues surrounding my father's death. I was not going to allow such a lapse in judgment to occur again, whether in the rectress's vision or out of it. I plunged my arms down into the bottom corner of the trunk, between dresses and stockings and other various bits of clothing and possessions, my hand feeling around for a moment, until my fingers at last brushed against the object of my search, the wooden side of an old jewellery box. I snaked my hand around it and drew it out swiftly, wrestling it free from the clothing that draped about it, carelessly flinging articles to the side before holding it out before me, victorious. I moved then, on swift feet, back to the bed, placing it gently upon the strewn covers, and quickly set to lighting the lamp which stood upon the nightstand, to serve as a light, before climbing quickly back into bed, pulling my legs up underneath me as a child might, and pulling the blankets around me once more. I sat then, for a moment, smoothing out the blankets over and over in front of my legs, as a lady should, before reaching for the box and drawing it closer. It was not an overtly large jewellery box, nor was it particularly innate by such standards, though it had a certain simple beauty to it. The box itself was made of a deep, rich chestnut, burnished and polished to perfection where the craftsman father had commissioned it from. Though it had spent the last several years in the bottom of my trunk, it was now worse for the wear, free of scratches or marks on its surface, its hinges still untarnished, and appeared to be in good working order. though perhaps it could use a good polish. On its surface, it bore a single stave that swept and waved, curving gently to and fro as it stretched left from right in a manner. A brilliant treble clef, tooled with a masterful hand, denoted the key before several measures of notes trailed their way along as in a sweeping dance of a silent melody. Gently, as I had done many times before, the box was tucked away, relegated to the depths of the dark and abysmal trunk. My fingers traced along the horizontal lines, swirling softly in the small oblong circles that were each note. My eyes closed in a moment that was part remembrance, part reverie, as I recalled the sound of the notes in my mind. Treble clef is often referred to as the violin clef. I recalled the small lights subjects and then again more slowly. I could not picture them as violin playing soft music. How his body so tightened and swayed as he drew the bowline across the strings. His fingers curled, seeming to dance long as he brought the song to life with his attentions. I couldn't vision the way his brow was furled in intensity as he breathed his soul into his creation, nor the serenity naturalness upon his face that I had seen on the faces of other musicians also at their craft, but I could not hear it. My memory, while unable to bring vision to the scene, was able to flood forth with the singing sound of the violin, as my father, a genius in the craft according not only to myself, but of learned men, had proclaimed. The bright, clear pining of longing and endless beauty warmed my soul and swayed softly where I sat, my fingers tracing a record of tones as my limbs sought to dance to a tune that echoed not through the halls of this empty manor, but my own mind. I kept my fingers in contact with the box for a long moment then, savouring the last note as it quivered and faded off into the depths of the memory from whence it came. And then, at last, lifted the lid, opening my eyes as I did so. The hinges, though intact and untarnished, had become somewhat stiff in their years of unuse. They were more tight than they ought to be, needing lubrication of some sort, but they nonetheless stretched apart, with naught but a soft squeak of protest, revealing the contents of the box. The interior was lined with a soft cerulean velvet that surrounded a square mirror that was inlaid into the underside of the lid, and it clutched tightly to the inner walls of several small compartments that comprised the bottom, as well as a portion in the centre, with its 4 distinct bumps that were designed to allow for rings or else earrings to nestle between them, held fast by the pliable materials underneath the velvet, to sit comfortably and securely on display. Any jewellery that this dresser case had previously held had been removed long ago, emptied at first unceremoniously in the haste of emotion upon the dressing top, and then more intentionally into a replacement upright piece with its dual swinging doors and large mirrored back, more akin to a miniature wardrobe than a jewellery box, that a friend had presented to me for my birthday that year, following my father's death. Instead, this wooden vestibule of fixation served as solemn chamber to house, first and foremost, the final letters that I had received from my father, and then, following his funeral and its presentation unto myself by the ever dutiful Wandsworth, my father's journal. The totality of its contents had remained in their present state for untold years, that is to say, locked away in the bottom of my trunk, unopened, unread, and unanswered. With a resolute breath, we withdrew the small bundle of letters, still tied together with a precise and exacting twisting of twine, from beneath the journal, leaving the latter within the box as I closed the lid, and set it carefully onto the bedding beside me. Slowly, with careful, nimble fingers, I undid the knotwork that bound the little bundle of envelopes, softly yellow from aging or the lamplight, perhaps both, apart. We separated the first from its fellows, setting them two aside for the time being. With my hands that were not nearly as steady as I might wish to profess them to be, and breath more bated than I care to explain, I held the first letter in my hands, staring down at the envelope, and the words written there in black ink by an unfamiliar hand addressing the envelope to me. For it was an unfamiliar hand at this point, having not known the joy of his correspondence through much of my childhood, when such things were unimportant, and then following through my adolescence and into womanhood after his death. His handwriting was as a scroll upon the envelope, uneven yet measured somehow, with as much intentionality and ceremony as befitting a man of my father's station, listing out my name and address at the institute. I held there for a long moment, looking down at it in longing and wonderment, imagining the man that had penned this letter, the envelope, the father that I had, in truth, never really known throughout my long years of separation. I flipped the envelope over in my hand, brushing my thumb gently against the golden yellow wax of the seal that had remained intact all these years. The telltale symbol of a violin pressed into said wax to formulate the seal that Father used to use for all of his correspondences. It was lovely, though time had turned the wax brittle, and it broke apart into 4 pieces as I pried it carefully open, unfurling the letter to read for the first time my father's words from so long ago.
Veri, I miss you as ever, my daughter, though I trust your studies are of the utmost importance to you. According to the regular reports I receive from the Institute, you have been excelling in your schooling, though your rectoress informs me that you have been more than a little mischievous. I trust this is just a phase, and you will continue to apply yourself. Pierre has returned home from the races, a blue ribbon winner this month, a large boon of course. The stallion in question was none other than the colt he loved so as a pony, Aldiar. He is off to stud for quite the price, and prancing about as though he owns the place. Wandsworth has brought to me this very morning a package that contains a gift for you, just arrived from the very finest of dollmakers all the way from Spain. I cannot wait to see the delight upon your face when you see them for the first time this summer. Join me at the manor for a well-deserved break. I am sure you will love them. Stay out of trouble moving forward, daughter of mine, and I shall be seeing you in a few short weeks. Your loving father, Alexander.
To read my father's words filled me with joy and delight, and I pressed the letter to my chest, near to bursting with joy of it. My father, proud papa that he had always been, was here with me in this letter, sharing his joy and news from home. My heart was near to bursting at the thought that he had sent away to a doll maker in Spain for a present just for me. I had loved dolls when I was a child. Perhaps that is why he took to collecting them in my extended absence during my time at the Institute. Oh, Father. I would have to look for the dolls that he mentioned in his letter soon enough. Perhaps Wandsworth knew where they were. I felt for a moment as though my heart would burst with the happiness, the sheer joy of my father's excitement, though carefully measured, as always. I had been thinking of me often, and actually wanted me to return home to see him that summer, to run and frolic with him through the garden and gaze dreamily into the stars while he played the violin amongst the flowers, their fragrance surrounding us on the breeze. I was filled to bursting with a warmth that radiated out from my chest, soothing my frayed nerves and relaxing my tense muscles, like sinking into a long-awaited bath on a chill winter's evening. The long-denied familial bonds sparked through my soul, igniting my delight with such a fervour that at once I tore open the second letter in excitement, eager to read on for more news from the past, and my father's voice started ringing as a shadow in my ears.
Veri, another fortnight has come and gone, and again I have received word from the rectoress of your misbehaviors. I trust, no doubt, that this is simply owing to the time it takes for my letter to be delivered unto you across the land. You are well situated to become a true and proper lady. How I wish her mother...
At that moment, a loud and precise rap at the door pulled me out of my reverie over my father's letters, and for the first time I noticed that the sun had risen behind the curtains, lighting the room around me with a growing dawn. Outside the door, the rectoress called warning that breakfast would be served in 5 minutes. Her voice was somewhat muffled through the thickness of the door. At once, deflated, the warmth and happiness and joy instilled within me by the ghost of my father as inked upon the fragile and dried out parchment, now brought to the light of day after their time locked away in the darkness, steadily fleeting, like a vain attempt to capture smoke with bare hands, intangible, ever slipping away and impossible to recapture. I am dressing as I speak, rectoress. Forgive me, I must have slept in. The familiar clacking of her heels against the floor betrayed no emotion or impatience, though I knew well enough by now that she was not pleased. Quickly, I replaced the letters to the box and returned it to its place in the trunk, this time not bearing it down beneath the contents, but rather resting delicately on top. Then hastily dressed and straightened my hair, realizing that I should be going the entirety of the day, having forgone sleep or rest of any kind. The morning meal passed quickly and pleasantly enough between the rectoress and I, if not mostly silently. Though I was seated at the table of my youth in the estate that was now and fully my own home, emboldened enough to bring apology to voice for my behaviour in the evening last. I was unemotional but contrite, softly yet earnestly professing my guilt for the spectacle that I had caused, and vowing that whatever such passions as had gripped me thusly should never design the chance to do so again. The rectoress, stern and proper as ever, responded only with a curt nod of her chin, a lowering of her eyelids, and a simple, "I should expect not." The rest of the afternoon and early evening passed by without any particularly noteworthy happenings. The rectoress and I made our way methodically through the manor, beginning in Father's master suite, long abandoned, and making our way through the rooms of the second floor, cataloguing the various books, paintings, statuary, furnishings and the like, in a large, leather-bound ledger which had been procured for just such a purpose. As we moved along, we denoted each item either with a small, neat checkmark or a single dash to indicate what would need to be packed and shipped to furnish my apartments at the Institute, or what should be sold in the coming weeks in preparation to leave the estate behind. I confess to having little enough input on what should have been bought or sold, though ye should not fall into the temptation that it was any ill or overpowering intent of the rectress, but rather that I simply did not have the capacity to find the decisions to be of particular import or sway over my heart. He was hardly sentimental about chairs, for example. And as the afternoon dragged on, the lethargy from lack of sleep coalesced in my limbs, leading to feeling altogether too warm, as one is wont to do when properly exhausted, leading to a sluggishness of mind that would likely have rendered such decisions mistakenly made. It was a relief to turn such important decisions over to the rectress, who had far more experience in such matters than I, and whom I had no doubt would make selections in the best interest of my happiness and comfort. After a simple dinner prepared by the cook, the rectress and I returned into the parlour, where Wandsworth had restored it to its former glory, without a hint of the violent passions which had overtaken me. A small fire had been lit in the grate, more towards the purposes of light and aesthetic than for warmth, as the late summer evening was pleasant enough. The flames licked and danced against the logs there, casting a warm and inviting glow throughout the room. We moved slowly, deliberately, along one wall of the room, looking at each of the dolls in turn. Now that I realised Father must have indeed taken to this collection in my absence. Wandsworth had returned them all to their places, each with its clothing fully straightened, their hair brushed and primped just so, their little heads resting gently, as if in the most quiet of slumbers, upon a shoulder, their perfectly painted porcelain faces pointing towards the inviting fireplace, where the portrait of my father gazed out of its frame to survey the room. As the rectress sat, perched in her careful manner, on the small love seat before the table, Wandsworth made his way into the room, carrying by the handles a large tea tray laden heavily with china. A teapot, cups and saucers, sugar bowl, cream bottle, spoons, several small plates, and a serving dish of tea cakes. Realising that I was in the way of his journey to the table, and being conscious of his burden, I at once pulled away from the shelves, drawing my skirts towards the centre of the room to clear his path. What happened next was a blur of emotion and clattering. Wandsworth, it seemed, having been focused so upon the tray that he carried, failed to notice my skirts as they swirled before his feet in an attempt to get out of the way, and he stumbled upon them, pitching forward and launching the tray in the same direction. scalding tea spilling onto the rug at his feet, and a great shattering of china sounding off the walls of the room as the pot snapped in half, cracking along with several pieces of china, as well as the dutiful butler as he crashed heavily to the floor. His knees made an almost thunderous impact as they collided against the boards, exposed by the small rug, followed by yet another loud thump as his chest impacted. And as he lay there, groaning softly and making an attempt to stand, only to clutch a hand to his right knee in pain, we realised that the incident had been entirely my fault. Had I stayed where I was standing near the shelves, he might have passed me by without a second's thought or hesitation. Certainly no truthful obstruction. Only I did not feel pity nor remorse as I looked down upon the old man who was struggling to rise to his feet despite the pain in his knee, doing his utmost to refrain from showing any severe outward signs of pain, and failing miserably if the tight crinkling of his brow and stern set to his jaw or any indication. I merely moved out of the way to seat myself carefully on the sofa nearby and observed his happenings. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl. Each ticking moment extended to the span of years, while I watched every faint motion connect to another. Each pained blinking of eyelash might have seemed as the passing of a day entirely. Each contraction of muscle as he rose and gingerly tested his weight upon the ruined knee seemed as a century before my gaze. And through it all, I felt not the slightest twinge of remorse or concern. No pity for the devastation I had wrought upon the butler, nor the china, held any sway or stirring from my soul at all, as he stooped, shaking slightly with the effort, and began to sweep broken pieces of shattered china into a pile, and then at last into the tray. I watched, still and silent, unconscious of even my own breathing, at the showing of an oddly detached sort of consciousness, unmoving, unfeeling, unfazed, unhearing of any of the apologies or other such utterances once worth offered and exchanged with their actress. I was perhaps more interested, more fascinated by the subtle sift, not only in my own disposition, but in the manner itself. For it seemed to me, in that years-long moment, that was but a brief instant in time, that the warmth of the room, the orange-tinted glow cast by the firelight behind us, beneath the ever-watching eyes of my father, had begun somehow to drain away, sweeping back from the far side of the room like a wave retreating at the tide. Slowly, painstakingly slowly. At first it had begun, only too subtle to perceive, but picking up pace more rapidly as it grew nearer towards the fireplace with its open grate. Along the floorboards it went, leaving behind not destruction in its wake, but rather a less brilliant, less saturated, less illuminated version of the polished wood. across and along the walls. Slowly, shelf by shelf it dragged, pulled away like a veil slipping along silk bedding. It ran, and made its departure over the first stall on each wall, training from its vibrance of their obsidian eyes and the rouge of their cheeks the shimmer and the lustre from their carefully coiffed hair. It was accelerating now. With each slow hinge of progress it made towards the fireplace, towards where the rectress and I sat on the small sofa, it was increasing in speed and velocity, along with my heart. Weary though it was from lack of rest and the events since arriving at the manor, my pulse in harmony with the strangely shifting lighting sped up, increasing in tempo the nearer and nearer it drew. Fear, pure and unadulterated, was racing through my body, all the little hairs on the back of my arms and neck standing up as I quivered, my breath heaving in my chest at its relentless approach. What was it, dear God, that could drain away all the brilliance and vibrance of the world? It was closer now, closing in on all sides, sliding along the ceilings and wall and floor in an unrelenting pace towards doom and destruction, nearly at the toe of my shoes as I cast about in panic, my eyes wide and frantic. My own pulse was rushing in my ears as I cast about, watching it move ever closer and closer, simultaneously transfixed and detached, trapped like a rodent in a cage, with nowhere to run, nor any to answer the call for help that was bubbling in my throat. I jumped to my feet without having any control over the action, nothing more than a frightened, panicked animal by pure instinct and the deafening, whooshing thump that was the sound of my own fleeting heart leaping in my ears. And my eyes latched onto those of the waitress who sat, her face as smooth as porcelain, and calm as ever somehow, unaware of whatever catching, spreading, creeping destruction was a mere breath away. And through the haze of my clouded mind I heard, though I could not see her mouth moving, the voice of the rectress resounding from everywhere and nowhere, deep within my mind, though surely without, snaking around me from every angle and tingling in my ears to cut through the wild fire of adrenaline. So, Veri, it has begun. It won't be long now.